Good afternoon, everybody. Good morning to those that are connecting from other regions. Welcome to this CFS side event. It is focused on Indigenous peoples' collective rights to land, water, and natural resources. This side event is organized by the FAO Land and Water team and the FAO Indigenous Peoples unit. And on behalf of my teammates, I would like to thank all the speakers that we have here today in the room and online. Before we start, please allow me to share with you some housekeeping rules. We have the support of Spanish and English interpreters, so please select in your panel the language that you prefer. We also invite our panelists to speak loudly and as clear as possible so our interpreters can provide accurate interpretation. I would like to give to welcome Marcela Villarreal, the director of the FAO Partnership and UN Collaboration Division at the Food and Agriculture Organization, for the opening remarks, and Mr. Darío Mejía Montalvo, chair of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. Darío, the floor is yours.
Muchas gracias por esta invitación. Quiero saludar de manera muy especial a todos quienes nos acompañan de manera virtual y aquí en la sala, Marcela, John, Mariana, todo el equipo. Para mí es un gran honor estar presente en esta actividad sobre derechos colectivos a las tierras, territorio y recursos naturales. Temática que desde el principio para el foro permanente han estado en el centro de la agenda de las discusiones, siempre que se realizan las sesiones de trabajo y siempre que se realizan actividades de todos los miembros en las distintas regiones del mundo, estos asuntos están siempre en primera línea. Y la razón de esto es porque para los pueblos indígenas sus territorios, sus recursos, sus tierras, así como el agua, hacen parte de su vida, de su identidad. No hay una división entre los asuntos espirituales y los asuntos materiales. Para los pueblos indígenas, la tierra es la madre en muchos lugares, el agua es la madre, el mar. De ahí se proviene, de manera que hay una intrínseca relación entre los asuntos cotidianos y los asuntos espirituales. Y estos territorios, allí donde se han tenido siempre, se han conservado a partir de sus sistemas de conocimiento, sus prácticas integrales, sus cosmovisiones, que han permitido que se conserven gran parte de los ecosistemas que son ahí el soporte para la vida misma en el planeta, y se conservan no solo para los pueblos indígenas, sino para el resto de la humanidad. Desde diferentes escenarios y voces se ha reconocido que los pueblos indígenas están al frente de la conservación de la diversidad y del agua en sus territorios, que son agentes de cambio con sus conocimientos. Sin embargo, la experiencia también nos demuestra que dichos conocimientos no se ven reflejados en el diseño de políticas globales, regionales o nacionales. Señoras y señores, hablar de derechos colectivos a la tierra, a los territorios, a los recursos naturales, al agua, para los pueblos indígenas, aún en el momento siguen siendo un postulado, un reto y un motivo de luchas. Pues la identidad, la condición de pueblos indígenas en muchos lugares del mundo todavía no son reconocidos por los gobiernos. En el informe del 2022, el Foro Permanente reportó que los pueblos indígenas sufren falta de reconocimiento y escasa aplicación de sus derechos en aquellos lugares donde sí se les ha reconocido, así como aún existen flagrantes vulneraciones a sus derechos y a sus tierras. Además, en la actualidad, sumado a estos retos históricos de falta de seguridad en la tenencia de los territorios, se suman retos relativos al cambio climático, la migración, la pérdida de la biodiversidad, el pretexto de la conservación para imponer formas jurídicas y de gobernanza sobre los territorios indígenas, la ampliación de la frontera agrícola y minera, y las apuestas por una transición energética sin la participación de los pueblos indígenas. Esto pone a los pueblos indígenas en primera línea, no solo por la lucha por sus derechos, sino también por la conservación de la vida planetaria. El reciente reporte sobre pueblos indígenas del Relator Especial para los Derechos Humanos al Agua Potable y Saneamiento, el señor Pedro Arrojo Agudo, demuestra cómo todas estas actividades en territorios indígenas están siendo dañadas y contaminadas las fuentes, poniendo en peligro el medio ambiente y la subsistencia de los pueblos indígenas. También el reporte del Relator Especial sobre Derechos de los Pueblos Indígenas ha recordado la importancia de analizar las áreas protegidas como estrategia para la conservación. Esto está alineado con las múltiples preocupaciones que hemos escuchado de los pueblos indígenas sobre las dificultades en la seguridad jurídica de los territorios indígenas en varios lugares del mundo y sobre la utilización inadecuada por parte de los gobiernos de dichas figuras para justificar vulneraciones de los derechos humanos de los pueblos indígenas. De otro lado, para el Foro Permanente es muy preocupante ver cómo cada vez son más penalizadas las protestas y las oposiciones legítimas que los pueblos indígenas hacen frente a las actividades mineras, así como el incremento de los homicidios de líderes indígenas alrededor del mundo. De la misma manera, observamos con gran preocupación que los derechos a la libre determinación y al consentimiento libre, previo e informado a menudo son ignorados por corporaciones y gobiernos a favor de las industrias extractivas. Como lo dije en mi intervención en las sesiones del Comité de Seguridad Alimentaria, con la conformación de los estados y las instituciones internacionales, los pueblos indígenas han quedado atrás. Nuestra voz ha sido relegada, así como que no hemos perdido y abandonado nuestros valores. A pesar de esto, la experiencia y conocimientos y capacidad para aportar a la humanidad siguen vivos, aún en estos tiempos de crisis. Nuestros sistemas indígenas de conocimiento y prácticas de manejo territorial son una respuesta notable para dar solución a las crisis del hambre y el calentamiento global. Así fue demostrado durante la pandemia. Durante este tiempo, muchos pueblos indígenas fueron abandonados a su suerte, pero con sus conocimientos pudieron dar respuesta no solo a sus comunidades, sino incluso en muchos lugares ayudaron a otras poblaciones no indígenas, tanto rurales como urbanas. Por eso es urgente la invitación a los gobiernos, agencias de las Naciones Unidas y al sector privado a que enfoquen sus esfuerzos posicionando a los pueblos indígenas, adoptando medidas con un enfoque basado en derechos y culturalmente apropiados y asegurando su participación significativa en la toma de decisiones. Para ellos es clave reconocer a los pueblos indígenas como sujetos colectivos de derechos. Esto lleva a que nosotros no solo exijamos la realización de nuestros derechos, sino que podamos tener condiciones para cumplir este deber con el resto de la humanidad, así como con nosotros mismos. Con esto quiero agradecer nuevamente esta invitación y muchas gracias por escucharme.
Muchísimas gracias, Darío. And now I would like to give the floor to Marcela Villarreal, Director of the FAO Partnerships and UN Collaboration Division. Thank you, Marcela.
Thank you, Mariana. Chair of the Permanent Forum of Indigenous Peoples, Head of Unit of Indigenous peoples in FAO, all the team, all of you who are following us from close and far. The role of Indigenous peoples in biodiversity conservation and climate action is increasingly recognized, and more evidence is being put forward by scientists about the role of Indigenous peoples' food and knowledge systems that they play in preserving biodiversity in the planet. Discussions at the recent Climate and Biodiversity COPs, Convention on Desertification, as well as in the UN Food Systems Summit, pointed a strong global consensus that Indigenous peoples' territories, governance, knowledge, and food systems are vital for climate regulation, biodiversity conservation, ecological restoration, and the future of sustainable food systems. In fact, Climate COP26 is at the Climate COP26, the international community pledged 1.7 billion for Indigenous peoples for protecting and restoring forests. By now, it is well known that Indigenous peoples' territories, mostly held collectively, cover 28% of the world's land surface and harbor 80% of the planet's terrestrial biodiversity. Despite this, and with exception of a few countries, the majority of Indigenous peoples' territories and natural resources remain without legal recognition and protection. For Indigenous peoples, the lack of identification, recognition, and protection of their land and water resources and their importance for spiritual, social, and cultural identity is an existential threat that often implies suffering and violence. Already the Right to Food Guidelines in 2004 alerted about the impossibility of guaranteeing Indigenous peoples' right to food without respecting their access to their territories, land, and natural resources. Today, we see how the systematic lack of respect of their rights places Indigenous peoples in situation of vulnerability. Tenure insecurity has led to forced evictions, displacement, and relocation of Indigenous peoples, affecting their security and their cultural reproduction and survival. Policies and practices linked to food production and agricultural supply chains are major contributors in Indigenous peoples' tenure insecurity. In terms of access to water, Indigenous peoples are particularly affected by changes in water access and availability. A sudden lack of water due to drought can mean lost income and food, threatening their lives and those of their families. In many countries, access to and use of water resources in rural areas is governed by customary arrangements, which may or may not be recognized and protected by formal law and by a range of informal water tenure arrangements. A key challenge to sustain and improve water, land, and food security for Indigenous peoples is to include such types of land and water tenure arrangements in the effort to effectively manage natural resources. The VGGT highlighted 10 years ago that land, water, and natural resources have social, cultural, spiritual, economic, environmental, and political value for Indigenous peoples. FAO's work with Indigenous peoples in recent years on generating knowledge and evidence on the sustainability and resilience of Indigenous peoples' food systems reinforces the importance of understanding the role of collective rights in the proper functioning of these systems. I therefore believe that this debate we're having today on Indigenous peoples' collective rights to land, water, and natural resources as key elements for biodiversity conservation and biocentric restoration is more urgent than ever. COP27 is approaching. Climate action is moving from negotiations to implementation. Climate action will have an impact on Indigenous peoples' territories and livelihoods, and it could be a positive or it could also be a negative impact. This depends to a large extent on the understanding, consideration, and respect for the collective rights of Indigenous peoples with which it is implemented. Therefore, I invite you to continue this dialogue and ensure that discussions like these also inform the shaping of the climate action plans that will take place in the coming years. Before closing, I would like to address the special topic of water, which is linked to the subject of this debate. So in July, the 28th session of the FAO Committee on Agriculture, called COAG by us, discussed governance of water tenure for food and agriculture, giving FAO a mandate to, 1, undertake an assessment on existing water tenure arrangements and their components, building on FAO's existing work to date. 2, in close collaboration with UN relevant agencies to support members upon request in building and developing capacities to produce data on available and actual use of water resources for agriculture. 3, in close collaboration with relevant UN agencies, initiate a global dialogue on water tenure on matters that include water rights administration, tenure arrangements within water use organizations, and to provide regular updates to that committee, to the COAG. Furthermore, COAG encouraged FAO members to participate in exchanges between countries at regional and global levels, including through the Global Dialogue on Water Tenure, in identifying principles for the responsible governance of water tenure. This dialogue can be an important process to sustain the human right to water and Indigenous peoples' collective right to water. FAO coordinates the Global Hub on Indigenous Peoples' Food Systems, where 20 research centers, universities, Indigenous organizations, and UN agencies come together to co-create intercultural processes of knowledge and evidence gathering. These efforts are fundamental to support the Coalition on Indigenous Peoples' Food Systems that actually will be launched next week officially. This coalition will ensure that there is a space of collective work between countries and Indigenous peoples that can propose policies and programs that protect Indigenous peoples' food systems and contribute to biodiversity conservation. It is important that Indigenous peoples' perspectives are included in this dialogue on water tenure. So I encourage my colleagues from the Indigenous Peoples Unit, the Land Tenure Team, and the Land and Water Team, and all the participants here to ensure Indigenous peoples' views are systematically included. Thank you all, and I wish you a very fruitful discussion. Back to you, Mariana.
Thank you very much, Marcela, and thank you very much, Daria. We know you both have very busy agendas this week with the Committee on Food Security, so thank you for making time to be here with us today. And now I would like that we pass to the panel of experts. As Marcela mentioned, this year marks the 10th anniversary of the voluntary guidelines on the responsible governance of tenure of land, fisheries, and forest, and therefore, this dialogue will provide an opportunity to discuss emerging issues related to the collective rights of Indigenous peoples, but also to reflect on how what have been the advancements and the achievements in these 10 years, and what are the challenges that are arising. I have the honor we have the honor to have here in this side event, Mr. Kundan Kumar. He's an expert researcher on collective rights of Indigenous peoples. He has collaborated with the University of Toronto and also with an international NGO Rights and Resources Initiative. And also he supports and participates in the social movement of Indigenous peoples' rights in India. Dear Kundan, thank you for joining us today. And we would like to invite you to give us more information about this reflection on what is the cost of insecure tenure rights of Indigenous peoples. The floor is yours. You have 5 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mariana. Let me share my screen, and I have a presentation. And Can you see the screen?
Yes.
Perfectly.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So, thanks, Mariana. I'll be speaking on the cost of insecure tenure rights of indigenous people. And my focus is not only the cost to indigenous people themselves, which as Dario and pointed out, it's huge, it's dire, but also to the larger global goals, especially linked to climate mitigation, conservation, restoration, and development. I think Marcela did cover the whole importance of indigenous peoples' territories to conservation and climate change, and the fact that 80% of the remaining biodiversity in the world is in indigenous territories. Now, the problem here is that we have potential for indigenous people to play a very critical role in the crisis which are facing humanity, the existential crisis we face of climate and biodiversity loss. However, there is a big problem there. The problem links to the status of territorial rights of indigenous people, their rights over their own territories. And what's very important to recognize that 50%, more than 50% of the territories of indigenous people across the world remain unrecognized by the nation states, by the respective governments, and are under often, because of that lack of recognition, rights under deep threat because of agribusiness, extraction, mining, so many other factors, invasion by non-indigenous people. And that is imposing a major cost on both indigenous people, but also on the potential of these territories for climate mitigation, for conservation, for ecological restoration. The costs to indigenous people, Dario has talked about it, means the lack of recognition of indigenous rights over their territories implies that they lose jurisdiction, they lose access, especially when these lands are taken away for agribusiness, for conservation, for sometimes even for climate mitigation. And that leads to increasing conflict, displacement, criminalization, repression, poverty, food and water insecurity, and cultural destruction of indigenous people. It means that this is a fundamental problem, and this is not something which is recent. This lack of recognition, the exploitation of indigenous people's territories is historical. Indigenous people have suffered quite a bit because of this. We all know the histories of that. But that continues at this point of time, even though at global level there is a recognition, increasing recognition of the role of indigenous people and the importance in meeting the crisis of climate change. The cost to global goals as such of not recognizing indigenous territorial rights are not really talked about much. And this, first of all, the ecological degradation and potential loss of biodiversity in indigenous territories, which is not recognized and is converted into agriculture, into plantations, and for extraction. That's huge, and literally the potential loss of carbon, as you're aware, from Amazonia and from countries like Indonesia and in Africa, in the tropical regions of Africa, is literally millions, hundreds of millions of tons of carbon is being lost. The biodiversity loss is also incalculable. At the same time, the efforts of the international community, the various countries, and for climate mitigation, conservation, the so-called nature-based solutions, are also at a major risk if indigenous people's rights are not recognized over territories. The major reason is that, indigenous people's lands territories cover around a quarter of world's land area, and most of the nature-based solutions of afforestation, of protection of forests, of tree planting, these are going to happen on indigenous lands. And if there are no rights are not recognized, the consequences are obvious. There would be land grabbing, there would be conflicts, there would be violation of human rights of indigenous people, and this is already happening, as we all know. There are many examples across the world where even nature-based solutions for climate mitigation, for conservation, and violating the rights of indigenous people. And that poses a major risk not only to indigenous people, but also to the investments for climate conservation and restoration. Ms. McKinsey, for example, talks about that almost $50 billion per year would go for nature-based solution. And a lot of it would be on investment would be on indigenous lands and indigenous territories. And the fact that there would be conflicts and human rights violations would not only would also pose a risk to the investment themselves, because there might be legal action, there would be reputational loss. So this is something that we need to really understand and address. And then, as Mario was talking about, the loss of indigenous people's knowledges, the food solutions, and resilience to deal with climate change, that is also a common heritage of humanity itself. It's not just important for indigenous people, it's important for our own ways of coping with the changes that are facing us in the near future. And that is something which we lose also because when territorial rights are not recognized and respected. The opportunities for effective indigenous peoples-led climate mitigation, conservation, and restoration. And there are so many examples of that, of such initiatives from across the world where the rights have been recognized. Those opportunities are also lost if the rights are not recognized. So this is something which is really important and is now increasingly being realized at the global level. And there's a recognition of this, the importance of indigenous people and their territorial rights for global goals itself, rather than only for indigenous people. And some of the important things that need to be done is that respecting the indigenous people's territorial and land rights and resource rights, and also the governance as a central tenet of conservation, climate change, and eco-restoration. This is something which at global level and at national level, we need to kind of think this as indigenous people and their efforts and initiatives as a central part of the solution to these problems facing us. And in protecting of indigenous people territories from external threats, stopping violation of human rights, stopping criminalization of indigenous people. These require efforts at both global level and at national level. And it's really important to ensure that global initiatives such as 30 by 30 Global Biodiversity Framework, the nature-based solutions, the forest landscape restoration, support indigenous people and recognize the central role of indigenous people in these processes and don't pose risk to them. So the safeguards in VGGT, the safeguards that we are talking about are extremely important. And one of the most important things is that we have to increase dedicated climate conservation and development financing and access for indigenous peoples and also to local communities. And this needs to really happen because what we have observed, and there are recent reports that barely any money really goes directly to indigenous peoples and their organizations for climate conservation development financing. But if you really start calculating their contribution to climate mitigation, to conservation, it's immeasurable. But that is not being supported by the international community, by the national governments. And since most countries, you find that it's the governments which are the major kind of bottlenecks for recognizing and supporting indigenous people in the stewardship of territories, we need to incentivize them. And as global community, as aid and as international organizations, to see indigenous people as the major part of climate and conservation solution and help them to support this, the indigenous people for these purposes. So with that, I'll end my presentation and thank you again for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Kundan, for this insightful presentation, an overview of the impact of the lack of recognition of indigenous people's collective right, not just for indigenous people, which is a big affection for their livelihoods and the existence of their peoples, but also for the climate actions and the advancement towards sustainable development goals. I keep one of the phrases you said that mainly all the solutions to climate crisis will take place in indigenous people lands. So that's part of the importance of ensuring the respect and recognition of collective rights. Thank you very much, Kundan, for this. And now I would like to give the floor to Mr. Stanley Kimaren Oleriamit. Kimaren is an indigenous peoples leader from the pastoralist Maasai community in southern Kenya. He is founder and director of Indigenous Peoples Livelihoods Enhancement Partners, ILEPA, a community-based indigenous peoples organization. Welcome, Stanley. I see you here with us. Can you hear us, Stanley? Great. Thank you, Stanley. I would like to invite you to share with us some information about the collective land tenure of indigenous peoples and the progress and challenge that have been during these last 10 years after the adoption of the VGGTs. Thank you very much, Stanley. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and good evening and good your time, everyone. Yes, my name is Kimaren Oleriamit. I'm a Maasai, an indigenous person in southern Kenya, and really honored to have the opportunity to reflect on issues around indigenous people and the progress with the VGGT. And firstly, I really want to reflect on why recognition of collective tenure is critical for indigenous people, particularly in Africa, and I bet everywhere. First is that indigenous knowledge systems are embedded in the landscape, land and territories that indigenous people find themselves in. That actually the landscape itself is a library on which this knowledge is stored. And so you fragment the landscape, you dissolve the knowledge associated to place. The second is that this collective tenure is also linked to collective governance and traditional decision-making arrangement. Basically, this is what enables the generation of this knowledge and the validation of this knowledge system through traditional governance arrangement. As mentioned by Kumar and others, collective tenure is also linked to nature-based solutions, particularly in the context of pastoral, where I'm familiar, indigenous medicine, pastoral mobility, food system, resilience to climate variability, and basically positive nature relation is founded on collective tenure. And also, this collective land tenure is a foundation. It's the glue that holds community together in terms of cultural identity, belief system embedded in nature. Every rite of passage is linked to nature for the Maasai, for example. And therefore, in the absence of recognition of collective tenure, is near impossible to imagine collectivities of indigenous people. And moving forward to bring it closer home to Africa, most of the land in Africa is claimed under customary ownership, most of it unrecognized. And 2/3 of African rural community rely on nature and forests for livelihoods. And basically 30% of, indigenous forest people represent 30% of forest peoples of the world. So basically, the very existence of indigenous people and local communities rely on the recognition of collective land tenure. If we move to the voluntary guidelines, the underlying sort of issues that it tends to address are: one is equitable access to land tenure and natural resources, particularly for indigenous peoples, local communities, and women's rights. And then it also seeks to address weak governance arrangement, decision-making around administrative arrangement on land, and also tries to diffuse the pressure on natural resources and the conflicts associated to land rights claims. And a number of African countries have tried to experiment with the voluntary guidelines, including Sierra Leone, Liberia, South Africa, Namibia, and Kenya, which I am familiar with. So what has happened in the context of the guidelines? If you look at Kenya, which I'm familiar with, increasingly we are seeing the law moving towards recognitions of land tenure, collective tenure, and natural resources. We have the Community Land Act 2016 and a new Constitution 2010 recognizing the rights of Indigenous people. And we have the National Land Commission really trying to bring on board the voluntary guidelines to inform land administration. But in practice, what are we seeing? One of the things is that we are seeing a disconnect between policy recognition, law recognitions, and the practice on the ground. Some of the challenges we are witnessing is that while land is recognized, land rights are recognized, historical claims and injustices are not dealt with. And so we are caught in this, we are stuck in this space where, yes, paper gives rights, but the practice does not deal with real issues of land tenure security. And so, and the idea is that, so it's death by paper recognition without the practice. And also we are seeing an opposite movement in terms of land tenure to fragmentation. While there's a law on collective land, the private sector is pushing towards privatization. Like the case of community-based conservation in southern Kenya, there is a push towards individuation of land in indigenous people territories, and then conveniently recollectivized for conservation. But once it is recollectivized, it is no longer indigenous alone owning the land. It's land held by private sector in the investment or conservation and indigenous communities. So self-determination and the right to this land and territories is compromised. We are also seeing a situation where, yes, the voluntary guidelines principles are reflected, but there are no resources to translate this recognition to meaningful rights on the ground. So there are no resources to implement this. And so basically the voluntary guidelines is a goodwill tool. And the focus also has been on state capacity to understand and implement the voluntary guidelines. But the reality, I think, is that the tool would be better, understood if both the supply of policy and law capacity is built, but also the claimants of land rights, the capacity on the voluntary guidelines is built so that it's demand-driven. Indigenous people demand the principles be applied. But I think there is very little, at least in the context of the African context and indigenous people in Africa, to internalize the voluntary guidelines so that they can demand, even for those governments that have indicated recognition. And so moving forward, I think there is need to make deliberate and proactive provision to enable operationalization of human rights-based approach, the safeguards that I think Kumar also mentioned, and particularly tools, in addition to the voluntary guidelines, like the ecosystem-based approach, which thinks about collective landscape, like free, prior and informed consent for decision-making in order to enable the self-determination of indigenous people, like community participatory mapping, so that then communities can map their waters, can map their sacred sites, and safeguard it from the market people interested in profits. And so I think the guidelines have triggered conversations. They have triggered a direction towards principles and norms that provide space for indigenous people to engage. But I think the engagement of indigenous people to bring them to the space so that it's demand-driven and resources to make it happen have not been optimal. We are seeing, for example, in northern Kenya, a situation where, yes, external actors come because there are no resources and they give resources. And community-based conservancies are registered, but they are registered together, as I said, with indigenous people. It's no longer their land alone. And this land is locked. It's not available. Once an indigenous person or group wants to move out, They cannot move out because the land is with lions and this and that, and you can only sell the land to the tourism investor. So it's actually a backdoor way of accessing these lands and territories. And so just to say, we need to invest resources, invest capacity and awareness on the sides of Indigenous people. And I thank you for the opportunity.
Dear Kemain, thank you very much for this presentation and overview of the African context, but also of the challenge of collective tenure land around the world. I would like to highlight a phrase you mentioned: collective tenure of land needs to be part of the solution to climate change. I think that this is one of the important messages delivered today. And with that, I would like to also thank the more than 50 colleagues, participants that we have here in this session. Thank you very much. And we invite all of you to share your questions in the chat box so we can read them after in the question and answer sessions. Now, I would like to pass to Jessica Stroil, senior attorney and who is part of the Environmental Law Institute, who's leading the Environmental Law Institute International Water Program, and that will share with us today an overview of the collective water tenure of Indigenous peoples, the progress and the challenge in the last 10 years after the adoption of the VGGTs. Jessica could not join us, but she shared with us a PowerPoint presentation that we will see. And we also have here our colleague, Sofia Espinosa from the Land and Water team that will help us if there are any questions and to go into deep in details about water tenure. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for listening today. I'll be speaking briefly today about the collective water tenure rights of Indigenous peoples, focusing on how these rights are legally defined and recognized. Over the last 2 decades, important progress has been made in
Florian, I think that we are listening broken the audio. I don't know if you can repeat the presentation. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for listening today. I'll be speaking briefly today about the collective water tenure rights of Indigenous peoples, focusing on how these rights are legally defined and recognized. Over the last 2 decades, important progress has been made in advancing the legal recognition of Indigenous peoples' land and forest rights, as we've been speaking about today. Yet the concept of water tenure has lagged behind the global discourse and practice, and until now, the legal recognition of Indigenous water tenure rights has yet to be widely tracked over time. In order to fill this gap, the Environmental Law Institute and the Rights and Resources Initiative developed a water tenure tracking methodology that applies a bundle of rights approach to define community-based water tenure regimes, or CWTRs, as an interrelated set of freshwater rights that, when held by communities as rights holders, form the basis of water security and promote communities' livelihoods, cultural vitality, and sustainable development. We identified 39 of these tenure regimes across 15 countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, 15 of which were specific to Indigenous communities. And I'll focus today on some of the important lessons that we derived specifically for Indigenous water tenure rights from this work. The first key finding of this assessment is that Indigenous peoples' freshwater rights are dependent on their legally recognized land or forest rights in 80% of the water tenure regimes identified. And this is significant for a number of reasons. First, tenure regimes with a land-water nexus like this also provided more consistent recognition of a wider range of community-based freshwater rights than those not based on a nexus. So for many communities, many Indigenous communities, the ability to realize a full suite of water tenure rights cannot be adequately safeguarded if their land and forest rights are not also legally recognized and secure. Second, the ways in which the nexus is created is extremely diverse, stemming from land, forest, agricultural and water laws, national constitutions, and even the incorporation of international treaties on Indigenous rights into national laws. This diversity highlights the critical need for improved legal harmonization to ensure water tenure security for Indigenous communities and support the integrated ways in which these communities steward their territories and the resources within them. In many cases, land and other sectoral laws mention water tenure only implicitly as part of a wider set of resource rights. At the same time, water laws rarely speak directly to the legal status of Indigenous peoples' customary or collective water resource rights. So even where a land-water nexus might provide an additional avenue for Indigenous communities to assert their water rights, if there are contradictions or lack of clarity between sectoral laws, Indigenous water rights can be left open to legal challenges, ultimately undermining both their water and food security. The second major finding is that only 1/3, or 13 of the 39 community water tenure regimes analyzed, specifically acknowledge women's water use or governance rights. And this number is even lower for the Indigenous tenure regimes at 26%. Where women's rights are recognized, they mainly take the form of quotas to participate in local governance bodies. But even where these rights are recognized, they're rarely water specific. Rather, they pertain to broader territorial or land rights with implicit recognition of freshwater governance rights. Without more specific legal requirements to engage women in water governance and ensure their equitable use rights, laws often serve to reinforce existing gender inequities and discriminatory cultural norms. These findings indicate that there's a lot of work left to do to clearly recognize Indigenous women's rights to engage in water governance and decision-making, and to ensure that these women are able to allocate water for their priority domestic and productive purposes and reap the equitable benefits of doing so. Finally, I just wanted to highlight the important role that regional and national courts have been playing in expanding the legal basis and scope of Indigenous water tenure rights and holding governments to account for prioritizing private sector development over Indigenous territorial rights. In the Atrato River case, Colombia's Constitutional Court ruled that the severe pollution from illegal mining in the Atrato Basin and the failure to appropriately consult with communities in the basin prior to granting mining concessions was in violation of the rights to life, health, water, food, healthy environment, culture, and territories of the Afro-Colombian and Indigenous communities living in that basin. The court's verdict relied on a novel concept of biocultural rights for Indigenous and ethnic communities, which, quote, result from the recognition of the deep and intrinsic connection that exists between nature, its resources, and the culture of the ethnic and Indigenous communities that inhabit them, all of which are interdependent with each other and cannot be understood in isolation. In Kenya, the African Court for Human and Peoples' Rights awarded a landmark victory to the Indigenous Ogiek people who have been repeatedly evicted from their ancestral home in Kenya's Mau Forest Complex. The government has justified this continued displacement as necessary to protect Kenya's water supplies, but the court recognized the Ogiek as an indigenous people deserving of special attention and affirmed their rights to their ancestral territories, including the water resources within them. The court rejected the Kenyan government's assertions that the Ogiek's removal from their ancestral home was in keeping with public interest, and found evidence rather that the degradation of the area was caused by encroachments from other groups and logging concessions. So very briefly, some of the key recommendations emanating from these findings and lessons include, first, that it will be critical to accelerate legislative and policy reforms, recognizing the full bundle of Indigenous water tenure rights that harmonize the provisions related to water tenure recognition and protection across sectors, and that remove any procedural barriers to tenure security. Second, it's imperative to strengthen the legal protections for Indigenous women's water tenure specifically, including addressing the linkages between their land and water tenure rights. Third, the role of customary water tenure must be highlighted, and avenues for legal recognition and protection of customary Indigenous water rights more fully explored. Fourth, we need to expand the data set we have so far and look more broadly and deeply at the issues around Indigenous water tenure and how it relates to broader territorial rights. Finally, Indigenous water tenure must play a central role in the global consultative process on water tenure that was announced at the beginning of this session that will be facilitated by FAO and its partners. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much to Jessica Troel for this great presentation on the water tenure and collective rights. She highlights very, very important topics. The issue of the lack of recognition of specific water rights and the use to women, the use of water and the participation in the governance of watersheds. Also about the role of courts and the advancement that we have seen in several countries like Colombia, where the river, the recognition of biocultural rights or the biocentric perspective, where rivers and natural resources has rights that needs to be respected. Thank you very much. And now I would like to pass to our next speaker, Mr. John Fernandez de la Rinoa, head of the FAO Indigenous Peoples Unit. John, we have heard about land and water tenure systems, the challenge and the achievements. Could you give us an overview of how these connect with Indigenous peoples' food systems and the role on or the next steps in the global action? Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Mariana, and thank you for the invitation. And I want to say that it is difficult to speak after Dario, Marcela, Jessica, Kundan, and Stanley. I think they have pretty much explained extremely well what the nexuses are and what is important. So let me try to perhaps make reference and reinforce some of the messages. The first message I would like to put forward is that there cannot be biodiversity conservation without Indigenous peoples' food and knowledge systems. And at the same time, there is no Indigenous peoples' food systems without water. Actually, the division between land and water, it is something artificial that many of us, we have created, but not the Indigenous peoples. They perceive the territory, the land, as the mother, and they perceive the water as the blood that insufflates and gives life to the mother. So without water, there is no life in the land, and we have seen this across the planet. It's only scientists, practitioners, and policymakers are starting to understand that without water, there's no land, and without water, there's no life. The fact that in terms of legislation and recognition, we have sometimes treated this differently in some countries is really nonsense, because it will be like treating blood and the body in two different conceptions if we talk to any human being or any being in life. No? So already, I think the linkage between food systems, water, and territory is fundamental. And on this, I think the linkage established in 2004 by the voluntary guidelines on the right to food is particularly important, because for the first time in a voluntary guidelines approved by member countries, and this is, let's not forget, 3 years ahead, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. So 3 years ahead already in the voluntary guidelines on the right to food, it was established that without access to the territories, without access to the lands, Indigenous peoples cannot guarantee their right to food. And this, of course, includes water and it includes land. Of course, in 2007, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples reinforced this very important concept. And in the 43 articles is widely explained this linkage and is very much aligned with free, prior, and informed consent and the right to self-determination. Now, in 2012, when the voluntary guidelines on the land on the tenure are adopted, Article 9 specifically talks about customary tenure. And this is a revolutionary document because it's the first tenure document that is endorsed by countries, even though it's voluntary, is yet a very powerful tool because it talks already about land, it talks about fisheries, and by talking about fisheries, it includes water, and it talks about forest. Of course, since 2012, the language has evolved. What is important in the voluntary guidelines is that already it states the respect of previous documents, conventions, and declarations. So it builds on previous advancements done at the international level. In 2014, the World Conference of Indigenous Peoples remind us all that the right term is territories, land, and natural resources when we talked about indigenous peoples. And this is fundamental, because by talking about territories, land, and natural resources, like Stanley has reminded us, but also Jessica and of course Kundan, we are really talking about collective rights. And we are talking about communal natural resources. And we are talking about mobile livelihoods that take place in these territories. And this is fundamental to explain the linkage between territory, food systems, knowledge systems, biodiversity. And this is really what came about in 2021. During the UN Food System Summit, scientists recognized for the first time that indigenous peoples' food and knowledge systems are game changers for sustainability and resilience. And this is fundamental because it was the first time that in a plenary with countries, scientists recognized this. And this is important because COVID-19 already was a reality check for all of us, where we saw that those indigenous peoples that have secure access to their lands, to the territories, and who preserve their food systems, had better food security than those indigenous peoples who didn't enjoy secure access to their land, to the natural resources, but very important, to the communal natural resources. Now, in the context of climate crisis, it's fundamental to reinforce this linkage between water, between territory, and between land, but very importantly, like Stanley mentioned, collective rights to communal resources. He said in his own words that this is the glue that maintains the communities together. And I will also add that this is the glue that maintains biodiversity together and ecosystems together. Without collective rights to communal resources, it's very difficult to maintain biodiversity. This very often goes unnoticed by policymakers and by countries. The other element I would like to speak 1 minute is mobility. Most of the enjoyment of indigenous peoples of their collective rights to communal resources implies certain degree of mobility in the territory. This helps preserve the biodiversity, but it is also fundamental to maintain the cosmogony of these indigenous peoples and to maintain the ecosystem diversification that takes place here. And we have seen in history when indigenous peoples are forced to settle, when indigenous peoples are displaced from those territories, the biodiversity suffers and the ecosystems deteriorates. Now, what is FAO doing in all of this? We have three key initiatives that I would like to share with you. The first one is the Rome Group of Friends that gathers over 35 countries that come together to learn about how to do things differently. And this is important because they play an active role not only in the Committee of Food Security, but also in the conventions and also in the technical committees. We are working with more than 20 organizations through the Global Hub on Indigenous Peoples' Food Systems to advance research with Indigenous peoples at the center. And the Wipala paper on Indigenous Peoples' Food Systems was a major breakthrough in putting Indigenous peoples' oral knowledge in a format that scientists could understand and in a format that scientists could reflect upon. And this was fundamental as well to give birth to the Coalition on Indigenous Peoples' Food Systems that Darío will be launching next week with different indigenous peoples across the world. And the coalition is about coming up with tools and coming out with dedicated programs that can advance in these linkages between water, territory, natural resources, and biodiversity. And this is fundamental to expand on this work if we want to address the issues related to the climate crisis and to the climate change. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, John. Biodiversity conservation cannot exist without indigenous people's food systems, a very, very important message. Also, I would like to highlight that mobility is part of indigenous people's food systems and part of the enjoyment of the territory. And just to retake the phrase that you and Kim Maren mentioned today, collective rights are the glue that maintains community, but also biodiversity and culture together. Without the recognition of collective rights, biodiversity, the culture, the communities and culture could disappear. Thank you very much for to all our panelists for this important and relevant message, particularly now that we are some weeks ahead of the COP27, and the discussions that are connected to biodiversity conservation and climate crisis will take place, and of course where collective rights should have a very, very relevant place. Now, we have some questions here in the chat. I will move the camera just to read some of the comment. We have one comment here from Clement Gamboa. 10 years later, it is necessary to strengthen the application of the VGGTs through different actors, especially community organizations and civil organizations, to promote the application for governments, and it's necessary to install permanent learning communities. Thank you very much for this comment, and I invite all our participants online to share with us your questions and answer. I have a question here, and I would like to invite my colleague, Sofia Espinosa from the FAO Water and Tenure team, Land and Water team. And Sofia, could you give us more information about this global dialogue of water tenure that will take place in coming days? Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting us and for opening the floor this time to water in these discussions. These experts meet, there's going to be an experts meeting next month during the 8th and the 9th November, because for two things. One is to launch the global debate that now FAO has had a mandate after COAG, and second is to keep the to keep all the momentum and all the activities that FAO has been supporting after the adoption of the voluntary guidelines, when water was not included in this text, but FAO felt the need and its partners to keep this debate ongoing. So after 10 years, 10 years ago, nobody was really, I think, ready to talk about water tenure. Nobody knew exactly what tenure for water could mean and how rights to water could be made into practice. So after 10 years of dialogue and building awareness and building partnerships, as we can see with ELI, and knowledge around these topics, where FAO is leading this global debate to build a roadmap on how this global debate could take place. And of course, all the visions will be taken into consideration, because we think that for Indigenous peoples, and this also includes, for example, pastoralist communities, the right to land and the right to water are essential for their survival. And so this is going to be taken next month. And of course, this will include all the partners and in the Indigenous Peoples groups. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sofia, and we look forward to receive the information and also to facilitate the invitations to Indigenous people so they can also participate in this process. We have here another comment, and it's for John, a question for John. For Indigenous peoples, you mentioned the division of land and water is natural, is not, it's something that is created outside Indigenous peoples communities. But can you tell us how ecosystem restoration and biodiversity conservation could be developed, including an Indigenous peoples perspective?
I think I will try to answer the question, but I think Kundan introduced some of the issues when he referred to the 30+30. There's an ongoing discussion to increase the percentage of protected areas across the world. Indigenous peoples, what they've been telling us is that they are not happy with the way protected areas are being created around the world. Of course, we all agree that we need to protect biodiversity. So what do Indigenous peoples mean when they say they are not happy? What is going on is that many protected areas are created in the lands, territories, and natural resources where Indigenous peoples have lived for hundreds of years. And the first thing that governments or organizations do when they want to protect some of these areas is to displace the Indigenous peoples that have actually maintained that biodiversity for centuries. Then they put some fence, normally barbed wire, and they bring some people from the capital or from the ministries to protect these lands that indigenous peoples have been protecting without fences, without weapons, and simply using their knowledge and using their observation of the natural cycles. This very often does not work very well. And we see biodiversity decreasing, but more importantly, we see indigenous peoples being displaced and not being able to carry out the activities that they've been doing for hundreds of years. At the same time, besides this terrible contradiction, we have a low-hanging fruit. And the low-hanging fruit is, why don't we do the opposite? Why don't we recognize the rights of these indigenous peoples that are protecting pockets of biodiversity? Why don't we recognize both their private and collective rights? Why don't we ensure their tenure rights in a way that they can continue doing what they are doing, that they have mastered over hundreds of years, but now with a recognition of the tenure rights, a recognition of the water rights, and more importantly, this really opens the way for a retribution of what we call ecosystemic services or nature-based solutions. That will, in a way, address many of the issues of the need to increase the protected areas. It will bring peace and prosperity to indigenous peoples, but also to the countries where indigenous peoples are living. And more importantly, it will probably be a much more cost-effective solution than creating national parks that follow court cases and follow the displacement of families that have been living there for hundreds of years. Indigenous peoples have one advantage over non-indigenous peoples, and is that they see life through a biocentric lens. They understand the importance of biocultural, biocentric approach to life, and they see life in any being, whether it is rocks, whether it is animals, whether it is plants, and whether they are manifested or unmanifested. And that implies a respect for all the environment and all the surrounding ecosystem that many non-indigenous peoples have progressively lost over time. And this is something that we need to rescue. And I think Jessica in her presentation talked about the biocentric rights of the Atrato or the biocultural rights that were used in preserving the Atrato River. But we have more examples in the Ecuador Constitution, the rights of Mother Earth. I think Bolivia has also done steps in that direction. And we see now how European countries are recognizing the intrinsic rights of ecosystems that, unfortunately, in the case of Europe, are damaged. So why don't we take those steps to recognize the intrinsic rights of ecosystems and biodiversity before they are deteriorated? And probably this is something that indigenous peoples can teach us, because they do it through their cosmogony, they do it through their culture, they do it through their storytelling. So this is one big lesson that we can all learn from indigenous peoples if we are serious about addressing the climate crisis.
Thank you very much, John. And that connects with the next question and probably the last question because of time that I would like to address to Darío. Let me just first put the camera on. Gracias. Darío, se vienen las discusiones sobre la acción climática en el mes de noviembre. ¿Cuál es la preocupación de los pueblos indígenas y el mensaje para estas discusiones ligados al tema de derechos colectivos y acción climática? Adelante.
Muchas gracias. Pues hay muchas preocupaciones en relación con el enfoque en el que se quiere continuar las acciones para la acción climática, vamos a decirlo así en genérico, pero en general lo que se está planteando, y quizás en esto hay un consenso entre los gobiernos y las agencias de las Naciones Unidas, es que se quiere caminar hacia la vía de la mitigación. Pero no estamos en un tiempo en el que haya posibilidades de adaptarnos a la mitigación, porque estamos muy cerca a los puntos de no retorno de la Tierra frente a la acción humana. Necesitamos tomar medidas realmente muy fuertes para contener la emisión de gases de efecto invernadero y para revertir muchas de las consecuencias que hoy día tenemos. Y esto implica que no podemos como humanidad seguir con paños de agua tibia frente a los efectos que está generando la misma acción humana. Y digamos que esta es la principal preocupación, que siendo nosotros apenas el 6.2% de la población sobre la Tierra, que hemos conservado muchos de los ecosistemas que están conteniendo la acción humana frente a los efectos que esto genera en el clima, pues no estamos siendo escuchados, nuestra voz no está siendo escuchada. La voz que sí se está escuchando como parte de la solución es la voz del mercado. Y también celebramos que haya las voces de la ciencia están siendo cada vez más escuchadas, pero también hay que decir que no siempre la ciencia ha acertado en las decisiones que se han planteado. Y además, porque no solo la ciencia es la única que tiene soluciones efectivas, los conocimientos de los pueblos indígenas que no están siendo valorados como científicos están quedando atrás, y la discusión en este momento ya no debe ser si los conocimientos de los pueblos indígenas son científicos o no. Lo que debe quedar claro es que son efectivos, porque así lo ha demostrado la historia. Y lo que se ha conservado en el planeta, los derechos que se han mantenido, la misma vida planetaria, depende mucho de que se respete y se valore a estos conocimientos milenarios de los pueblos indígenas. Entonces tenemos muchas preocupaciones, y al margen de esto, pues hay dos discusiones que me parece que son muy importantes, a las cuales en la forma como se presentan resulta muy difícil oponerse aparentemente. La primera la acaba de mencionar John, que es sobre conservación de ecosistemas estratégicos para el planeta. Resulta muy difícil oponerse a la conservación en sí misma. Para los pueblos indígenas lo que sí resulta problemático es la manera como se está pretendiendo conservar, pasando por encima la propiedad de los territorios y pasando por encima de las formas de gobierno que han estado en estos territorios por miles de años, y que es justamente lo que ha permitido conservar. Es un contrasentido querer conservar acabando con la forma como se ha conservado milenariamente, desconociendo estas formas. Ese es el primer punto. Y el segundo punto tiene que ver con la transición energética. Resulta muy difícil que alguien se oponga en este momento a que se generen nuevas formas de producción de energía distintas a las fósiles, pero necesitamos asegurar que los pueblos indígenas puedan participar de manera activa en esa transición energética, porque de lo contrario lo que vamos a tener es una profundización de un modelo de economía de enclave y de un modelo de economía que se centra en la conectividad y no en los servicios que necesitan las comunidades y la gente. Pero sobre todo porque esa forma de trabajar la transición energética basada en megaproyectos es una profundización del extractivismo, del desconocimiento de la propiedad de los territorios y de acabar con las posibilidades de participación de los pueblos indígenas en decisiones para la humanidad. Me quedo ahí, muchas gracias.
Muchísimas gracias, Darío, por estos puntos y estos dos mensajes importantes. Thank you very much for all the questions. We will not be able to address all the questions, but I have here some comments that I will read very fast, and we passed for the closure with Maria Paula. One of the biggest problems is that funding for climate and action and conservation do not arrive to indigenous peoples, and it's implemented without free, prior, and informed consent, as some of the speakers mentioned. And the other one is that it's important that blue economy developments also learn of what it has been advanced with key land issues and collective rights in relation to land. Thank you very much for all these comments. And now I would like to pass the floor to my colleague, Maria Paola Rizzo, Land Tenure Officer in FAO, for the closing remarks.
Thank you, Mariana. Thank you all. So, what to say? I have taken so many notes during this session, this event, and this discussion that it's very difficult to summarize. We will stay additional 2 hours here, so I don't want to keep our participants for too long. I just would like to highlight that this discussion is very relevant and very timely in this point of our lives. As Dario mentioned, his concern, the indigenous people concern, is that we might be very close to a no-return point. And we are facing real challenges, real threats to our environment, to our lives, to the climate, to the food systems. So what has been discussed here is really fundamental. And my takeaway, I would just not to keep the participants and all of you for too long. My highlight from this event is something that Jon mentioned, that is the connection between conservation, food system, territories, natural resources, and the fact that all of these are interconnected. So what I would remind from these discussions is that we need to be close and to be tuned to the value that the indigenous people are portraying and are perpetuating from very long time, and that also something that Dario has said is that we are trying not to conserve and to preserve, but at the expenses of those who have traditionally preserved and conserved the environment and our Mother Earth. And this is a contradiction. We should really, I invite all of us to put our professional efforts in keep on trying to give visibility and recognition to the value and to the key role of the indigenous people, traditional knowledge, food systems, and territorial management, these collective rights. It was very interesting what Stanley said, Kimaren said. We all were very impressed by the definition of collective tenure as a glue. No? And let's have this glue for all of us, not just indigenous people, but all of us, because we are all interconnected, we are all linked, and I would really encourage all of us, as I said, to put our professional efforts to advocate and to promote the recognition, the protection of the indigenous people traditional knowledge, and also us as human beings to be tuned with our hearts and our souls to the value and the cosmogony of indigenous people, because this seems to be the only way to protect our Mother Earth and ourselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maria Paola Rizzo, for these inspiring words to close this session. Thank you very much to all of our participants, to all of our speakers, Kundan, Stanley Kimaren, Jon, Dario. Marcela has to leave to another meeting, but thank you also to her for joining us. Jessica, that shared her presentation, Sofia Espinosa, Thank you very much to all and to all of our participants. And we hope to see you in future discussions. And let's continue talking about these topics involve water, land, and tenure. Thank you very much. Ciao, ciao.